Hello, everyone. Welcome to the discussion with Ernst Schraube. After his talk, we'll wait another minute or so for people to slowly come over here, and then we'll get rolling. Okay, there are still people coming in, but we have lots of time to discuss. So I think everyone will get their chance to ask a question. I am really happy and excited to have this conversation with Ernst, as so many conversations I have had with him before. It's not a big secret that Ernst is what we call in German one of my Vorbilder. He is an academic teacher who, first of all, values reading. If he reads something, then he really reads it. I think he is one of the very few people in the world who has read everything Klaus Holzkamp ever wrote. And I think the same is true for Günther Anders and many others that I don't know of. And beyond that, Ernst is also a scholar who takes teaching, and you might have guessed that from his presentation today, who takes teaching seriously. Something that is important for me as well. And if you ever get the chance to see Ernst, not only when he gives a presentation as you have now, but in a classroom, I really recommend that. He's one of the most exciting teachers I have ever met. Okay, so as you know, the Q&A tool is open. Please post your questions there. And if you have been to one of our discussion sessions in the past, you know that the moderators usually take the privilege to ask the first question. And this one is no different. Ernst, in your talk, in many ways, you touch upon central issues we face right now. Within 2-3 weeks, we have reinvented the way in which we teach, or the way in which we deliver our content. And in many ways, I have the feeling that we're discussing a lot about what can be done in terms of tools. And that's something I think you in your talk argue against, understanding technology as primarily a form of tool. But I have the feeling that we're not discussing much about the actual changes that this implies for the way in which we understand teaching and learning. And I wanted to ask you whether you can speak a little bit to that, because that's like right out of the middle of what we're experiencing today.
Yeah, you know, my talk is about learning. So the activity of learning, and not about the activity of teaching. That would be another talk. So, and this is with intention, because most of the work and research about digitalization and educational practice, or about digitalization and learning and teaching, is about teaching. And even in this research of teaching and learning is confused. The research is saying it's about digitalization and learning. However, it's about digitalization and teaching. This teaching learning short circuit you also can find in most of the research, the contemporary research on digitalization and learning. And usually the perspective of the learners and a reflection on and also the theorization and conception of learning is deeply weak. Neil Selwyn, one of the central figures in research on digitalization and learning, he realized that. So, and he wrote that it's a central task to include the learners and their experiences if we talk about digital technologies. However, Martin, I totally agree. We also have to think about teaching. So, and how digital tech, okay, but here, and also I think we would have to rethink teaching. And here are discussions on the way. Many people are doing that. For example, Gerd Biester. So he's thinking about rethinking teaching. So, and actually, and he's arguing in a similar line like myself. He's not calling it teaching as a worlding practice, but he's exactly saying we have to teach that we prepare learners or ourselves to the world in which we live today. So that is teaching. So he hasn't, so, and building on that, we would have to think, where do these digital technologies help or not? However, usually, and I just mentioned it quickly in the talk, colleagues just understand now teaching, oh, we just do it with the digital technologies much more efficiently, do the same in just online, there's not much reflection what actually happens. So they just see, oh, new possibilities, new horizons of possibilities of teaching. However, that would have to be thought through much more in detail. What these digital technologies mean exactly for teaching.
I know that your talk is about learning and questions are coming in, which is great. I still want to push you a little bit on the teaching, a little further, because you also talk about Holzkamp's concept of a short circuit of teaching and learning. Learning is a function of what we teach, right? And if we look at the literature that describes exactly this short circuit, without reflecting it, we come up with things like Bloom's taxonomy. It appears everywhere, the kind of way in which our students supposedly go through different levels of understanding complexity. Or newer initiatives, the Universal Design for Learning guidelines, that some courses we have to, in some universities, we have to adhere to when we design our courses. So yes, I agree with you that in the last years, of course, things have happened there. We're not simply thinking about teaching stuff and then they either learn it or not. We have this idea of a learner-focused environment there. But still, and you mentioned that in your talk, and I would like you to expand a little bit on that, because I think that's one of the crucial points. Still, our understanding, I'd say, of learning is that this is a form of internalizing. Somehow, something's out there, and somehow, if we create the right conditions, and we have realized the right conditions are not anymore the lecture halls, maybe something else, but the right conditions, if we manage that, somehow this outside will go into this student, and this student will somehow learn it and maybe even have fun doing that, and maybe pay lots of money also. That's maybe sometimes also relevant. But my question for you is there really an advancement in the learner-centered approach, or is the learner-centered approach maybe much more a neoliberal translation of the classical model of the teaching learning circuit, short circuit that we had before?
Yeah, Gerd Biester is exactly saying that this new language of student-centered learning is just a new form of neoliberal way of in a way, I agree with him. However, and that's why I say, oh, just forget language of learning. Don't work on that. Let's work on the language and rethink the language of teaching. However, I disagree with him here, because the neoliberal language of learning first is bisecting the content of we learn and the how we learn. Student-centered learning is only allowed, so that's a student-centered. It means I can influence the way how I learn. No influence on the topic, on the content, so on the problems. This cuts learning into pieces and I would say destroys it. And Biester is arguing against this bisected way of learning. So it's bisected actually. However, if I talk about learning as a worlding practice, though, this means we need, if we learn, we cannot learn if we have no influence on the problems we want to learn. Otherwise, I don't want to learn anything, and there's no reason to learn. Mm-hmm. So this learning activity and here I totally agree with you, requires also teaching. So, and this teaching is not only a teacher. So that's a historically later form. Teaching and learning are activities, often they are just within myself. So I also teach sometimes myself. I'm in a dialogue with myself. Or now we too are in a dialogue. You teach me something to expand a little bit my thoughts, to think things new. Maybe I also teach you something. So there is a fluidity of teaching and learning. And the interesting thing is, I would think about these digital devices and technologies out of the content, out of the problems and the activity. So, and here you can see, of course, these digital devices can help that we understand and think further on. Also, this dialogue we have here now online. So I'm not against online technologies. However, this teaching, learning fluidity. So you never, if we meet together, there's something very strange. If I try to grapple with problems and I don't understand things, if I'm learning in a deep learning process, earlier I met with my friend and we just talked together, and then we did. So when he moved away to England, we tried to do it on the phone. It didn't work. So it helps sometimes with Skype and with the phone. So yes, but it is more limited. So, and here we have to find out where are the possibilities and the limits. So, and explore that much, much more in detail.
Before we go into your conception of learning as a practice, I want to quickly ask you maybe a clarification, or maybe I want you to give us some more flesh on Holzkamp's theory, which I think clearly underlines or Holzkamp's critique, which I think clearly underlines your concept. You say that, in the words of, not necessarily the words of Holzkamp, but stemming from Holzkamp's theory, you're saying that the teaching and learning short circuit systematically disarticulates the subjectivity of the learner. I think that's a crucial point to understand in order to realize why we need a new practice. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? And then I'll turn to the many, many questions that come.
Yeah, I think Holzkamp, he wrote a good book about learning, and it took him 10, 12 years. And he always said, oh, if it only takes 2 months for you to read it, then good. So I worked so long on it. It's a very smart critique. Also appreciating what can we learn. He was going through the various learning theories, psychological learning theories, and also carefully exploring what can we learn from the different learning theories. And then he's trying to rethink it in a very interesting way. He also has, of course, limits. He's not talking much about teaching, for example. So I think he also still, you know, I argue for learning not only as a practice, but as a worlding practice. So that learning connects us. It's not putting something into the brain the other way around. It connects us with the world. So and it's related to our everyday life and how we live our everyday life and the crisis problems we experience. During Corona now, we are in a permanent learning process, trying to out where are we here? What happens in this world in which we are? That's why it's also, we need extra energy in these times. So, because we are always in a, you can see, learning as a worlding practice. Usually, if you, teaching, learning short circuit, which Holzkamp in detail described, it is what we also you and me still have in our minds, that learning is, you learn something, Martin, if you listen carefully to me and if I put it into your brain. So if you listen, you learn from me and what I said. However, and then the focus is only on the teaching activity, and it identifies as learning with teaching. That's a fiction, so an illusion. If you give a lecture in front of 100 students and then ask the 100 students, what did you learn the last 5 minutes? You will get 100 different answers. Everybody is learning something else. So therefore, hopefully, if we are discussing with each other, there's hopefully we can learn from each other, because we need each other. We need that we help each other to understand things in our learning activities, where I would say teaching starts. So, and however, if you identify what you teach with what you learn, then you are in this teaching learning short circuit where you just disarticulate the learner. So, but who is learning? It is a learner. So maybe sometimes even the teacher. I try to make lectures that during the lecture, I learn something. That the teacher, through the teaching, is exactly learning. And that's also why many of us at the university love our work, because through our teaching, we learn. So this fluidity is interesting. And then the big question today is, how in these activities do these digital devices, platforms, systems help or not? Where do we have to make a distance? Where should we involve them? So they are part of our learning practice. However, we can relate. How in a smart way? That's the big question.
Indeed, that is the big question. And that is the big question that Ines Langemeyer is effectively asking you, Ernst. He says, hi, Ernst. Thank you very much for your inspiring talk. I think you're making a very good point about the bisection of learning, splitting up the content and the method. But how do you address the relationship between the content and the method in an integral manner? Do you have an example how learning could look like?
In an integrated manner?
Integrated,
oh,
yes.
Yeah, okay, integrated. Yeah, the interesting thing I think is, if the content of learning, if you have no influence on that, if the content is not in the center, so actually I would say you cannot really learn. So if I want to learn windsurfing, for example, how to make a jibe, so out of this, I have to think, what are the ways how I learn? What are the methods to learn how to jibe? So if I, otherwise, and then I can say, oh, I read a book, I watch a YouTube video, different methods are possible. I ask a friend. So I just practice without talking with anybody. I just talk with myself. I teach myself. So there are different methods. However, these methods and what is the best method depends on the content, what you learn, and the problems. That's crucial. So, and if you are as a learner, how would you say, if you have no influence on the content, then you have a hard time. And that's also why we have to motivate our students. Why should they learn anything? We have to press them because they have no influence on the problems. As soon it is that learning becomes a very boring issue if you don't have an influence on the learning problem, and also the method of learning becomes totally unclear. And then, of course, I shouldn't talk so long, but just one more sentence. Of course, if our students, they have this transfer idea also in their mind, because we have to reproduce our knowledge at the exam. So, and then digital technologies and digital forms of learning is, of course, the best form to put, to effectively reproduce the knowledge. So that's in their mind. However, you don't learn much. So learning and the method, the practice of learning depends, and to structure and arrange your learning process in a best way, what is necessary in the future. You have to have an influence on the learning problems. Not sure I could clarify how this connection. It's a good question. This connection between content and method.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And if I try and step into Ines' shoes for a moment here, even though they're way too big for me, I think what she's asking is also if we teach those who are going to teach in the future, what kind of methods can we give them? Because it's well, easy. It's not easy to say, but it's one way of approaching the problem to say, well, the method depends on what we're going to learn. But then we need a form of generalized discourse, how we organize the learning process. And I think Ines is asking here a little bit, what are the general guidelines if we talk about how learning, teaching learning can function in a more generalized way from a method standpoint?
Yes, I try to give a very short comment on that. First step, the learners have to have an influence and even determine the problems, the questions they are learning. So some universities, actually most universities in a way do that. At my university, the students, it's a bit an unusual university, half of the time of the students from the first semester through their whole studies, half the time of the semester, they do project work, problem-oriented project work, where they just choose a problem of our time today and do research about that in an interdisciplinary way. That's the first step. Actually, you find that at any universities, but usually later, either in your master thesis, that the students can define themselves the problems. So, or at least on at the PhD level, and totally at a conference level. So if I would learn something and think about things where others would say nobody would take me seriously. So, but that's what we expect from our students. So first step, the problems in that the learner has an influence on the problems. Second step, dialogue. So teacher learning dialogue, and that this is a fluidity. The teacher also learns from the learner and the learner from the teacher. This old-fashioned, the positioning, here is the teacher, here is the learner, and to fix that is actually, in a certain way, misleading, and so on and so on. It's a good question, and I also have to think more. My focus in the last years is just to rethink theory of learning, because there are so many weaknesses. Even there's so long and such a long history of learning is not really well thought through. And that's what, and I would say today in a time of crisis, so, and in the future, we need an expanded version, an expanded rethinking of learning, which connects us, learning which connects us to the problems. We need students who are prepared of identifying problems in our world and to work with that independently. That's what we need in the future. Too bad. This old-fashioned transfer model relates to an old-fashioned society which no longer exists.
Jens Brockmeyer picks up exactly this and says, Ernst, your talk reminded me of what Vygotsky, Piaget, and Holzkamp have in common. They all provide fundamental critiques of the broadcasting model of learning. It's good to see that you continue this powerful tradition of student-oriented learning. And he continues and says, so what are possible anti- and post-colonial strategies to subversively appropriate digital tools and extend agency and subjectivity in the sense of Holzkamp?
Yeah, also a good question. I'm not totally sure whether I would call my understanding of learning as student-oriented. I prefer problem-oriented, because the problems, we learn with the problems together. And for this, we need the learners and the teachers, and it often goes back and forth. So who is the learner and who is the teacher? I learn a lot from my students, I have to say. So that was also something interesting, by the way, with Holzkamp. Holzkamp, he had a very close relationship to us as students. He was listening to us. So he was on one level. He was not the big professor. He was listening to us, to our experiences. He was learning from us about the world today. So that was interesting. Okay, so my question is, how can these digital devices help for problem oriented learning, or even more clear, world learning as a world in practice? How can these digital technologies help us to connect us with the world. So, and here I agree that sometimes they help a lot. So, and Holzkamp, he died 20 years ago. He in his learning book was the last one he wrote, the big book. Here he thought a little bit about computers, and he realized that computers, they can help in certain instances. And here we can think further on. They can bring us in touch. What I said also in my talk, they connect us so easily. They connected with the world. That's the interesting thing with the digital devices. They connect. So they cannot connect us with each other, but also with the world. But this connectedness is contradictory and dialectical. So, and I think we have to, first we have to be aware of that and explore it in much, much more detail. And out of the learning problems and learning where we try to understand something, out of this world in practice, we have to involve digital technologies, and sometimes we have to be aware that they will hinder, that we develop our thoughts carefully enough. So they undermine. So we can see that with our students. So they have a hard time. If they listen to a lecture, they are at different spaces around the world, because this digital technologies connect us with many places, and so on and so on. And we can see it ourselves. Sometimes, okay, I could talk more. Holzkamp, for example, I built on him in my talk. With Holzkamp has a very good idea that a crucial moment in learning is what he calls affinitive learning phases. I don't like phases, but this moment's affinity, where we try to think in connections. That's what we need today. So, and then he was thinking, oh, what are prerequisites for that? So one he's saying, it requires presence, that we are here, that he's saying also that we have time and no stress. Pressure hinders that we let our thoughts wander around, that we go into a tentacular mode. Affinitive learning, it's funny. Holzkamp called it affinitive learning. I don't like the word, because affinitive, who understands affinities? But it is in a certain way, affinities means to understand things in connections, to make kinship. Donna Harry is calling it kinship. And tentacular thinking. So there are similarities. And then we have to think, what are the preconditions for that? And do digital technologies help for these preconditions or not? So in this direction, I think we have to think further on. And to think, that's what often happens today, that we think about the digital technologies, just throw them into the learning space, the students love it. So they don't love it. There are more questions, so I will say that maybe a little bit later. There's a huge danger, just to say it in one sentence, there's a huge danger. Some universities are also saying around after Corona, so half of our teaching is now online. Yeah. So we have good experiences, let's just continue. This is a bad argument. The argument about including digital technologies or not, involving them and distancing, the principle should be the content of learning and thinking things in their connections.
I want to connect Babette Babisch to this. She says, one of the inherent problems or advantages of digitalized learning is that one can assume that if a podcast or a YouTube video has been downloaded or viewed throughout to the bitter end of the YouTube timeline, then one has learned. This goes hand in glove with today's virtually omnipresent use of the phrase learning outcome, as if one might quantify the learning in terms of those outcomes. Thus, I agree with the notion of bisected learning as a problem per se. The politics of this kind of technology is the quantitative that seems evident. How many are present, etc. This, in a traditional learning mode, would be the very, very least of it. I want you to take this and speak maybe a little bit to what Babette mentions here, the learning outcome structure. that we increasingly face at universities. How does this go together, again, with a reshaping, with a new understanding, hopefully, of learning, with a student-centered learning process, and also with digital technologies? And maybe even more so, how can we potentially find workarounds to this problem of the learning outcome that we're forced to formulate and maybe even fulfill in our courses? How can we approach that critically?
Yeah. I think the concept of learning outcome or the idea, and also already the idea, if students just see a podcast and downloaded it and have seen it, and usually that's also interesting with this new platforms. There's also much more surveillance from the teachers and the professors of the students, which often the students just do not know, and so on. So we can see, is this text downloaded? Did they see this video or not? Okay, to see a video doesn't mean that you have learned anything. So it is like a lecture. So you sit in a lecture. What happens with the students? You do not know. You have no idea what they learn. So maybe, yeah, so we would have to ask. But the idea that we just transfer knowledge into the brain is fiction. And then the idea, then we make tests, exams, and in the exams they reproduce the knowledge, we put them into the brain. So you can pass any test without learning anything. Then learning becomes a problem of action and not of learning. So that is the issue. And that's why this kind of learning is a waste of time for the students, for the teachers, I would say, that's my point, we cannot afford that anymore. We need students who are independently able to identify problems of our world today and work with that. That's a totally different idea of learning. And this idea with learning outcome, effects of learning, it goes in the same direction. Most of the research about digital technologies is about the effects of learning on a learning outcome. So you cannot measure that. That's just fiction. How can you measure learning, whether somebody learns something? It's fiction. So, okay. So we have to, that's why I say, we have to fundamentally rethink our understanding of learning, which of course also involves a fundamental rethinking of teaching and of educational practice at universities, schools, kindergartens. However, we have, during the last long time, we have traditions which exactly are working on that. So it's not something new. And we also have it in our university practices. We also have it in our own practices of learning and so on. Yeah, thanks for this good.
Kate is expanding on this thought with her question. She says, first of all, thank you for an inspiring call for holding onto an embodied experience of learning. Where do you see the integration of creative practices such as drawing into learning? As an advocate for art school practices within the learning experiences, I wonder whether this is a time for a greater integration of these tools as a way to bring an embodied experience back into learning.
I agree, totally. Learning is this affinitive learning modes. So that is the creative moments where we try to think and we don't understand something, but we want to understand it. Or I want to be able to chime with my surfboard, but I can't. So there has to be some creativity on the play. And art is a wonderful, or poetics and so on. They are, because they connect things. So, or they can help us to connect, to see things in connection. That's why it is a good idea to build on that, I agree. And it goes to the heart of real learning, where learning means I do not understand something, I want to understand it, and then I move to that. So, and here, that's a creative process. I also thought yesterday, I heard Paul Stenner's talk about liminal hotspots. I would say affinitive learning is a liminal hotspot where we have to move and be creative. Yeah.
Paul Stenner himself is asking a question here, but I'm going to take Niklas first, who is interestingly also connecting to the idea of liminality, maybe without mentioning it, but I still read it in his question. So Niklas gives me quite a long text to read, and I'll try to deliver it. He says, "Cheers, Ernst. Loved your presentation and feeling very privileged. I can experience that much more often than many others." As a footnote for everyone out there, Niklas works with Ernst in the same department. My question, you mentioned the affinitive learning phase as tentacular mode of knowing, where one does not necessarily know yet what, but wants to learn something. But how do we get to know what it is we want to learn? Does that not emerge from our engagement with socio-material practice or the world? And is practice not already digitalized in many ways? Perhaps some of us nowadays still want to learn something non-digitalized, but may that not change over time as the world becomes increasingly digitalized? And proactively put, where is the problem with that?
Yeah. These are various questions. First question, how do we identify problems? So the problems we want to learn. So what are relevant problems? I would say these problems emerge in the way how we live our everyday life, the way we live our everyday life and in our activities and actions. If we don't know what to do, then Hoskamp calls it a learning loop is required. So we go out from our usual actions or activities and make a learning loop, which is itself an act of learning. I want to understand something better. So and of course I would agree with Niklas. They are not inside my mind. They relate to the world in which we live. So during the Corona crisis, there was lots to learn about every day, and there were lots of conversations. Okay, and of course, in this learning practices, so I introduced the concept learning. Learning is not only a worlding practice related to the world, but also requires a certain practice, a certain space. Some call it an environment, a space, a context, a situation. I call it practice. I like practice much better, because it says that I do it, but also others do it. It connects me historically with others, with the table, with my computer, and so on. Other people did that. So, and of course, digital devices are part of this learning practice today. So, however, this doesn't mean that I'm always online, that I have I'm always on email. If I want to really focus on something and go into affinitive learning or really want to understand something, I don't start my day with checking my email, because then my brain is also already totally disturbed. So we can relate, even if these digital devices are part of our learning practice, we can relate to it. And that for this, I'm arguing that we have to be smart, how we relate to these digital devices, which of course are part of our learning practice. I'm not against digital technologies. I'm happy with them quite often. However, if we just surrender to them, so we are lost. Learning will disappear, and we can find that actually within ourselves, and also with our students, I would say. So that some of them have a hard time to take this time to take things seriously and take the time to switch off Facebook. If you are constantly on Facebook, on Twitter, on email, shopping during the lecture, of course it will hinder that you understand things in their connection. So that's why I'm arguing for digital confinement, which is necessary to relate to things.
I want to go to the next question that comes from Jana Peters, and it starts with a promising line. That is, I contradict your statement that there cannot be learning if students have no influence on the content. And she continues to say, I would like to argue with a personal experience. I was able to learn a lot in school and university with fixed contents, without the need of motivation from others. I would like to say that this statement is too easy. I think even in institutions with fixed curricula, there is always room for learning and even for expensive learning.
Yeah, good question. And I was a bit quick here in my presentation. In a way, I understand what you're saying. However, I disagree. So, because if you go to the university, so for example, study psychology, so it's already you who say, oh, I have here a problem with psychology. I want to understand that better. That's why I go to study psychology. So you already defined in general the frame, the problematic you want to be involved. So, and then from here, you understand and listen to the content presented to you, and you do something with that. You just, this content is not just going into your brain. So you relate to this content, and you have to, because knowledge is always contradictory and limited. So if you just take what your professor is saying for granted and as a final truth, as knowledge, so you haven't learned much. And this real learning and real knowledge development and understanding requires that we know that all knowledge is situated, partial, perspectival, limited. So therefore, that you relate to this knowledge is crucially required. And I assume you have done that.
Sorry, I want to use the remaining time that we have to switch a little bit over to another topic that you touch upon and that is highly related in your talk. I want to focus a little bit more on technology. You talk about technology in your own terms, in terms of Günther Anders, and of course, Langdon Winner is an inspiration for you. So technology as contradictory, you describe it as a contradictory form. You also describe technology as embodied materialized action. And I find that highly interesting. And you also argue with Günther Anders that technology in effect is something that carries forms of decisions within it. There are pre-decisions we have to live with if we use that particular kind of technology. I have two things that I want to bring together. One is a question of my own. The other one relates to what Gordana Jovanovic is asking here. The question that comes from me goes in the direction of saying, to what extent are we right now in a phase that can be compared to what we had in the Middle Ages, where we had the monasteries and the monks that reproduced a particular form of knowledge, and outside of the monasteries, people were largely unaware. To what extent is the Silicon Valley and the people who produce effectively or who create all those practices that we use right now, also to have this conference, to what extent are they the monks of the 21st century and we are the peasants outside? And I want to connect that to what Gordana Jovanovic says here. She says, I think it would be fruitful to draw attention to Marcuse's critical analysis of technology, which of course you know. He stressed the specific rationality embedded in technology. We're mostly focusing on performance of technology, forgetting its way of thinking. A necessary condition for technology is translation of qualities into quantitative data. In that way, technology very powerfully shapes and reproduces a specific epistemic culture and political culture. This is a special challenge to humanities and psychology understood as human science. What would you say about that?
Yeah, too bad. I agree with Gordana, or not too bad. Too bad, because there is really a problem. Even in psychology, even in the critical approaches, cultural historical activity, also critical psychologists, Holzkamp, it took him quite a while to understand that technologies are not just means to an end. So unproblematic, and only it depends what we do with them. So that was his idea. We can do with them what we want. These are tools, instruments. He realized later in his life that this is too limited. in psychology, we still think often like this about technologies. Within science and technology studies, where Langton Winner is a central figure developing that field, but also Bruno Actor network theory and Donna Haraway and others, it is clear so that not only science is a specific political form, but also technology. Science and technology is not such something neutral, but inherently political. So they do something. So if they are in the, like Gordana nicely formulated. So, and this doing, we have to be aware of. This doing is of course contradictory. So, and we are confronted today with that. And we have, that was one of my point. Therefore we have to relate to these digital devices. Today, we are in a time, there is a political, we are with the corona or in a certain political time. So people are already, or companies are already preparing for the time after corona. So, and there is a movement from a Green New Deal to a Screen New Deal. Noamin Klein was also writing about that, how the big high-tech Silicon Valley companies are already trying to intervene. So, and within this digital devices and systems platforms, politics are inscribed. I think Shoshana Zuboff's book about surveillance capitalism, she's describing it really in detail. So how the politics embodied in this digital devices and more, and actually there's a history of literature analyzing this. She's not the first, but she's doing it in detail and very visible and unusual because of her position, that she's so critical. However, that is my point. If these digital devices are not innocent. So, and if we just think, oh, just take them into our learning practice at home or at universities, the companies are coming into our home. So into the universities, there is a digital colonization. So that's what I was arguing for. So, and a decolonial turn would require that we smartly relate to this political contradictory practices and confront us with that.
Our time is almost up. However, I want to ask you one more question, also because it's kind of a nice rounding up of your entire talk. You start out with a reference to Habermas, interestingly in a similar way that Thomas Theo did. And I didn't press you on the Habermas issue, but Paul Stanner is doing that now. Paul Stanner is saying, thank you that you mentioned that Habermas quote, we learn more and more about less and less, but he's asking you, is it maybe the other way around now? We learn less and less about more and more. What do you think about that?
Yeah, of course, you can just also turn it around. He was saying we learn more and more about less and less without relating what it means for us as human beings. So, and he's saying that about modern science. Modern science helps us to learn more and more about less and less without relating it to human life. So I think that's the interesting thing. There's a certain discrepancy and gap within modern science, a deep problematic. And I would expand that to technology. So we have more and more technologies without relating it to our human life. So, and here is the problem. And therefore, Günther Anders was one of the first who very carefully thought about that, about this acceleration of technological progress or technological development, and how we have a hard time to follow that. And in a certain way, my talk today is trying to think learning and follow these digital developments and how our understanding of learning to bring that together. That's crucial. This gap between science and technology and creation of a certain world without knowing what we do and what it means for human life, that is one of the central roots of the crisis we are in. Therefore, to overcome that, that's a little step what I try to do with this thinking about learning, teaching, and digital technologies.
Thank you so much, Ernst. Our time is basically up. If you can give me a really short answer to one final question that I want to raise, because you talk about that before, in the very beginning of your talk. And it's a theme that runs also through out the discussions at this conference, the relevance of psychology for today. And many have pointed to ideas of saying maybe academic psychology cannot help us in any kind of way with creating a post-COVID-19 future. And I think you are of a different opinion here. And I want you to just articulate that maybe a little bit and explain to us how psychology can effectively help to shape a new theory and also, maybe much more importantly, a new practice of learning, so that we overcome what you describe as something that we don't have the time for anymore.
Yeah. I think Hank Stam's talk yesterday was very nice, and he was saying one of the central tasks of psychology is to render human experience intelligible. So I think that's very nicely said. So we in psychology can take human experience, for example, with crisis, with the problems of today, also with technology, seriously. And Hank was saying psychology until now is not really psychology as a science, doesn't give us a good vocabulary. He was heavily actually criticizing that, to understand, to make this experience and our actions, understanding our actions intelligible. I think that's the task. And I think we have to rethink psychology and fundamentally, but within the universities. So if we just throw them out and say, oh, psychology, don't care anymore about it, it should happen outside the university, I don't agree. I also think we have to claim psychology as a science. I'm German, so Wissenschaft, so science in German means to create, and in many other languages, by the way, as well, not only in English, you don't have this connotation. Science, Wissenschaft means to create, to achieve knowledge, to gain knowledge. So, and psychology is, it's an important part to focus us on, as individuals in the world in which we live, on human life, on how we live our everyday life in the world and the problems we have in the world. That's where our students will work later. They have to take the problems of people seriously. Okay, so I think we have to rethink psychology as a science. So, and argue for that this kind of thinking, worldly thinking, should have a space at the universities and inside, because our society, our future requires this kind of knowledge.
Thank you very much, Ernst, for an enlightening discussion. That was great. And we could go on for another hour easily, but unfortunately our time is up. We'll take the remaining questions over to Slack, where Ernst will be happy to answer them. If you don't know how to get on Slack, just shoot an email to pgc@aup.edu and we will guide you there so that you can ask Ernst more questions or answer them. Okay, thank you all very much. See you soon.
That was fun. Thank you very much, Martin, and all the others. Thanks for your good questions.
Bye-bye. Bye now.